Hello, class. So today we're going to talk about archetype. So what is an archetype? Why is it important? Why do brands care about archetype? Well, actually, archetype has been created from Carl Jung's work. This is a psychologist quite some time ago, but has some application for how we think about brands. So the way we want to think about archetype is actually it's an instinct that informs the way we perceive our experiences. Okay, now again, this goes well beyond brands and business. We're talking about just human characteristics here. Hardwired instinct. That's what we mean when we talk about archetypes. So when we think about behavior, we're talking about the things that we do. We talk about rationale, it's what we think, emotion, what we feel, instinct, that's the stuff that shapes our perceived experience. Okay, and that's what these archetypes are about. And you can find them in literature, you find them in psychology. But what's really interesting is it's like a shared hardwired trait of human beings that these archetypes exist. So with archetypes, all the forces in nature, what an archetype really is, very similar to these forces in nature. They are dynamic, they're unpredictable, and they behave independently of our conscious mind. Okay, so think about this as an unconscious construct, kind of running in the background of the human psyche. Now the thing is, how do we interact with archetypes? Okay, now again, because it's unconscious, we don't interact with them directly. Really, we interact with them through stories, images, dreams, the way we build our aspirations, characters that we admire for different traits, these kinds of things. Now, when we use archetype for brands, the way it's currently used in a lot of ways is to explore a brand's meaning, get inspiration for creative work, align teams to a broad strategic approach, finding these values that the brand can kind of center themselves around and articulate the way a brand shows up. Again, this idea of brand meaning. Okay. Now, there's nothing wrong with these types of applications of archetype. The only issue, though, is that it's actually much bigger than that, and sometimes that's where the ball gets dropped. So the issue, again, is with the interpretation of how the archetype comes to life and the importance of it. Much more powerful than I think a lot of ways that we currently use it today for a number of brands. Instead of having groups of just isolated characters, traits and characteristics, things like that, it's much bigger, and we'll talk about that a bit. Again, coming from Carl Jung's work and more recently Carol Pearson, again, it's a very easy idea to kind of pick up because we're familiar with different stories and characters and people who kind of embody these different archetypes. But the issue, again, is that it's very easy to put down a lot of times. So what you'll find is like on a lot of these brand wheels and things like that, archetype will be called out and it lives on a piece of paper, but never really gets built into the actions of the brand. So again, back to this point on action. What's really interesting here is that our behaviors, our action, both as an individual and as a brand, should be driven by our archetype. Okay. Now, again, archetypes are fluid in individuals, right? And we'll get into this idea of having a dominant archetype and then some more secondary archetypes. Okay. But the idea is that when we identify those for the brand, then actually we should be using that to dictate what kind of behaviors the brand does. Okay, and the way that it interacts with people. So let's take a look at the 12 core archetypes. So the first one is called the innocent, with the motto, free to be you and be me. The core desire here is to get to paradise, and the goal is to really be happy. So I'll let you read through the rest of some of this information. Now, these archetypes go by different names. I'll call that out also. So you see at the bottom here, the innocent is also known as the utopian, the traditionalist, the mystic, the saint, so on and so forth. So in different models, they'll go by different names. There's some other models that have more than 12 archetypes. So just be prepared for that. For our purposes, we would use these 12. Okay, so one archetype being the innocent. There might be some brands that come to mind that you can think about that really embody this archetype with the core desire to get to paradise or the goal to be happy, right? And so everything their brand does, all their actions really are about this idea of being happy and getting to that idea of next level in paradise, okay? The second archetype, the orphan, regular guy or gal, the model that all men and women are created equal, with a core desire of connecting with others, and the goal ultimately is to belong. Okay, so think about some brands that might fall into that space. The hero, here the motto is where there's a will, there's a way. The core desire is to prove one's worth through courageous acts, and the goal is expert mastery in a way that improves the world. Okay, you'll probably come up with some brands pretty quickly that fall into this space. There's the caregiver. The motto, love your neighbor as you love yourselves, to protect and care for others. And the goal is actually to help other people. Number 5 is the explorer. This whole idea of don't fence me in is the motto. The core desire is the freedom to find out who you are through exploring the world. And the goal is to experience a better, more authentic, more fulfilling life. Okay. Real core desire here is about exploration. Okay. But the exploration really ties back to freedom, if you will. For the rebel rules are meant to be broken is the motto. The core desire is revenge or revolution. And the goal is to overturn what isn't working. So again, what's really interesting here, let me just pause at 6 for a minute, is that these are a number of different characters or archetypes that you see come up in literature that you're probably familiar with. I mean, you can think of different characters from movies, let's say, or stories that fill these different archetypes. But really think about this. I mean, the core of this whole argument is that these archetypes are instinctual, hardwired human points of view, if you will, or traits that actually drive our behavior. Okay, and then for any individual, myself or you or anybody else in the course or in the world, will fit into these archetypes at different points in their lives. Okay, and flex through a number of different archetypes. So this is a very human type of approach to understand people at a much deeper, unconscious level. Let's look at number 7, the lover. The motto is you're the only one. The core desire is around intimacy and experience. And the goal is being in a relationship with people, work and surroundings they love. Okay. The creator. The motto is if you can imagine it, it can be done. The core desire is to create things of enduring value. And the goal is to realize a vision. We look at number 9, the jester. Motto, you only live once. The core desire is to live in the moment with full enjoyment. The goal is to have great time in lightening up the world. Okay. Now, again, I'm sure tons of brands come to mind when you think of the jester. I mean, I have a few in my mind already. When you think about the sage, the truth will set you free. The core desire is to find truth, and the goal to use intelligent analysis to understand the world. Again, lots of brands fall into place here. I mean, think about different news organizations. Think about CNN, right? I mean, you think about the brand of CNN. The sage is probably a key archetype for them. The magician, the motto is I make things happen. The core desire is understanding the fundamental laws of the universe, and the goal is to make dreams come true. If we look at the ruler, the motto is power isn't everything, it's the only thing. The core desire is control, and the goal is create a prosperous, successful family or community. Now, when we get through those 12 archetypes, they're actually laid out in this kind of format that are on these 2 different axes, from freedom to order and from ego, focus on the individual, to social. Okay. Now, what's important about these is that you have 3 archetypes that are grouped under one of these kind of larger motivations. So this idea of freedom, the motivation of freedom, really is found in the explorer, the outlaw, and the jester. The motivation of the ego or the self is really the core behind the creator, the hero, and the magician. Then you have this need for order, which really falls behind the sage, the ruler, and the innocent. And finally, this more social motivation, which is behind the lover, the caregiver, and the everyman. Now, that doesn't go to say that those 3 in each of these areas is the same, because it's not. We just walk through them. There are differences between them, but they can all be centered around a core motivation. Okay. Now, I did want to point out that when you talk about how brands use archetypes, there's a couple key pieces that are important. There's the base archetype, which is really like their primary or central archetype. Okay, and what that means is we find that archetype through all the previous and historical brand behaviors over time. So if we look at a brand over time, how it was created, the kinds of things that it did, the way it came up, the way it found success, the consumers that it reached out to, we can usually identify a base archetype, and that is really going to be your core archetype. Now, it's really helpful to have 2 supplemental archetypes as well. And what those supplemental archetypes are really it's the way that the archetype has shown up in different contexts, okay? They kind of take on a new life. And we can identify 2 separate archetypes based on context, okay? So what this really does, though, when you have a base and these supplemental, it really rounds out the archetypes of the brand, okay? It makes it a little more real, like a real human being would be, versus just being stuck and boxed into one single archetype, okay? But again, a great starting point is to find stories and images that allow you to identify the core archetype of a brand. Now, again, once you have this information, you can ask yourself questions like, how does the hero, put on an event? How does the hero do its advertising? There's different ways you can think about your core archetype and how it should show up, what kind of behaviors, what kind of actions it should do based on that archetype. And then that's really when you're living and breathing that archetype in your brand versus just saying, hey, what kind of traits should come through or what should advertising look like. It's actually about the behaviors, focusing on that really makes this powerful. So here's a quick example just to wrap up this discussion. It's for a candy bar named Smash, okay? So again, when we look at Smash throughout time and some of its historical advertising, it fulfills this expression and instinct to destroy obstacles and burst free, okay? I mean, just at a deeper, more human level, okay? We can also identify the whirling and spinning iconography that they use, this idea to like loosen and disarm. Okay, so you can start thinking about those kinds of traits and how they fit into to an archetype. But how does this come across on shelf? What context do people experience Smash? How does Smash actually introduce itself to consumers? When we do that, we can start to identify some different things. It's a more sustaining type of archetype when you look at their advertising, how they show up. How does the brand show up in like this young lady's experience, for example? What are the implicit images and story that come from this, okay? And then from this kind of work, we can start to identify what is the core archetype and what are the supplemental archetypes for a brand like this. And once we've done so, then we can make sure that the brand shows up and behaves in those ways moving forward. And that consistency is really what can help build your brand, okay? All right, great. Let me know if you have any questions. Thanks for the time, and we'll talk again soon.